and ends to clean up to finish our discussion of an introduction to JavaScript. So the first thing we want to talk about is collections. Now, if you just watched that amazing video from Saturday Night Live, the floor walks and dessert topping video, I highly encourage you to watch it if you haven't watched it yet. But it helped put the idea of JavaScript collections in context. What I'd like you to do for a moment is think about what are the collections that you know how to work with right now, all right? So hit pause for a moment, think about it. Well, okay, so if we want to list some collections, we've got an array. Whoops, my pen just got a little confused again. Hang on a second. And now we're back. Okay, so we have arrays. That's one type of collection. We have a stack. That's another kind of collection. And we have a queue. That's another type of collection. So it turns out that, well, it turns out in JavaScript, the JavaScript idea of an array is all of these things. Let's try this. Seems like I'm running out of juice on that. I can get it to pair. There we go. All right, let's try this again. All right, so a JavaScript array is all of these. And the elements in an array can be either primitive or complex. And they can be of any type. JavaScript really doesn't care. So in many respects, the way the list type operates in Python and the way the array type operates in JavaScript are very similar. Another thing that's kind of cool is that the arrays or the array length is dynamic. So it can grow and it can shrink as needed. Okay, so let's look at how to create an array. So I can say var array equals new array 3. Now I have a 3-element array. All right, var array equals new array 1, 2, new number 3. So that's another 3-element array. The interesting thing about this, right, is this is a primitive number. This is a primitive string. And this is a complex number. So that number and that number are different. Okay. And finally, var array. I guess this would be array 0, array 1, and array 2 equals new, equals 1, 2, new number. Okay. Okay. So your number 3. Man, not a lot of technical problems there. All right. Okay. New number 3. All right. So we got a third way of creating an array. Okay. So let's talk about how we access. So that was creating. Let's talk about access. All right. So if I want to look at the first element, I could say console.log array 0. If I want to look at the length, I could say console. Oh, by the way, this would output the first element. So in this case, this would output 1. Console.log array.length. This would output 3. If I say array sub 42 is equal to 42, this is pretty crazy, but what it actually does is it expands the size of the array. So now the array has 43 elements instead of 43 elements instead of 3 elements. So if I say console.log array.length, I'll get the value of 43. If I then say array.length equals 3, and then I say, if I say array.length equals 3, what will happen is it will chop out all the elements except for the first 3 elements of the array. So the array sub 42, if I were to do console log array sub 42 before doing this line of code, I would get the value of 42 printed out. If I were to do a console log array sub 42 after setting array.length equal to 3, I would probably get, I actually don't know what I would get. I'm thinking I'd probably get an exception because that element hasn't been defined yet. So that would be my guess. In any case, you wouldn't want to do it because this has set the size of the array to 3. Okay, let's talk about viewing the array as a stack instead of as an array. So we can view it as a stack. So I am going to call my variable here stack, but it doesn't actually make it a stack. But I'm going to think about this as a stack, and I'm going to put on Tim and Mike on the stack. So the way to think about this is the bottom of the stack, and this is the top of the stack. So if I say, or another way to visualize it is here is Mike, and here is Tim. This is my stack, which is, we can say my stack is growing this way if I want, all right? So I just put Mike on top of the stack. All right, now if I say stack dot push Bob, then what's going to happen is Bob is going to get put on the top of the stack there. And then if I say console.log stack sub 2, now I'm not treating it like a stack, I'm treating it like an array. Well, this is position 0, 1, and 2. So I'm going to output Bob. All right. Here's another variable. Here's a variable s, and I'm going to say s is equal to stack dot pop. So when I say stack dot pop, it's going to take the thing that's at the top of the stack, which right now is Bob, and return it and change the stack. So we're going to have s is going to be equal to, s is going to be equal to, will be set to Bob after this. All right, and the stack will look different. We'll now have a stack with just Mike and Tim on it. All right, so that takes care of stack. Now you can also treat this collection, which is either now an array or a stack. You can also treat this collection as a queue. Okay, kind of messing up the discussion of the queue, so I'm going to try again here. So let's say we set up a queue and we put 2 items on the queue, Tim and Mike. The first element in the array is basically an example of that's at the front of the queue. The thing at the beginning of the array is at the front of the queue. Stuff at the end of the array is at the back of the queue. Now, if you want to add something to the queue, you usually, well, you can go to the end of the queue if you want, in which case you just do a queue dot push, or you can put it at the beginning of the queue. So if I want to put something at the beginning of the queue, what I would do is I would say queue dot unshift Bob. Now, if I were to look at the queue now, I'm going to have Bob, Tim, Mike. This is the front of the queue, and this is the back of the queue. Now, if I want to pull something off the queue, if I want to pull something off the front of the queue, then what I'm going to say is their front of the queue equals queue dot shift, and now f will be equal to Bob. Okay. Well, it took a while to get to that, but we did. All right. Now, I want to talk about next is multi-dimensional arrays. To finish off our discussion of collections. So if we wanted to create a 3-dimensional array, there's a little bit of work. A 3-dimensional array is essentially a 2-dimensional array of, I'm sorry, I'm going to create a 3x3 array. So it's a 2-dimensional array that's 3x3. So what I'd like to do is create an array that looks like this. 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2. So it's kind of a matrix, right? So the way you construct this is you create the multi-dimensional array out of multiple 1-dimensional arrays. So we're going to create a 1-dimensional array here that's going to be a 1-dimensional array of 1-dimensional arrays. This is just how Java works, except that the syntax in JavaScript just isn't as elegant. So here we go. Var 2D equals new array 3. All right. And then I'm going to create a for loop. So for var I equals 0, I is less than 3, I plus plus, and then 2D sub I is equal to an array or a list, I guess an array, I. Okay. All right. Now, if I run this, the way this is going to work is when I is 0, 1 and 2. So when I is 0, we're going to have 2D sub 0 equals 0, 0, 0. So it's equal to an array that has the value 0, 0, 0 in it. Okay, and that's going to end up as our first row in our two-dimensional array. And then we're going to have 2D sub 1 equal to 1, 1, 1, and 2D sub 2 equal to 2, 2, 2. And there we go. That's how we build a multi-dimensional array. All right. If I want to access an element in this array, so for example, I wanted to access the centermost element of the array, of this multi-dimensional array, and that would be this. The coordinates for that are console.log 2D sub 1 sub 1. And that's going to give me the value of 1. Okay. Now, last thing that I want to tell you about, doing our basic overview of JavaScript, is functions. So let's take a look at a sample function. So if I want to create a function in JavaScript, I just say function. Now, function is how you do procedural abstraction in JavaScript. So it's basically the equivalent of a method. So function example A, comma B, var x equals 42. Let's see. And then I'm going to say y is equal to 43. I'm doing this deliberately. You notice I did not put a var here. I just said y equals 43 because I want to demonstrate something to you about the difference between local and global variables. So when I do this, y equals 43, I've now declared a global variable. Global variables are variables that exist outside of any function. And that means funky things can happen with them. And so I'll show you that in a second. So if I say console.log, and I just print out the value of A, and print out the value of B, and then I say return X. Let's see what happens when I write some code that that executes this function. All right. So here's the code that executes the function. I'm going to say var result equals example tree 3. Okay. So tree ends up getting mapped to A, and 3 ends up getting mapped to B. Result gets the value of return X, which is 42. So result's going to get the value of 42. And this global variable here, Y, gets set equal to 43. So I'm going to do some console logs, and let's see what we get. So console.log result. And then console.log X. And then console.log Y. Okay, so result gets the value of whatever return X is, and X is 42. 42 inside example. All right, so we're going to get 42. When I say console log X, this is going to give me an exception, which is that this variable hasn't been declared. The variable x hasn't been declared. Now, of course, it was declared here inside example, but when we're outside of the scope of example, that x goes out of scope, and there is no global variable x that's declared in this program. When we do the console log of y, we're going to get the value 43. Now, that's interesting. So because y is a global variable, since we didn't put var in front of it, it's global to the entire program. So we can access y both in the function example and outside the function example. So I want to put a little warning here. This kind of behavior, forgetting to say var when you use a variable for the first time, is really bad news, because global variables they are that looks happy. I'm going to take those eyes out. Yeah, that looks evil. They're evil. There's too many weird things that can happen with global variables that you're not expecting when you use them inside functions. Because now that y is exposed as a global variable, any function can change the value of y, and it may be hard to keep track of that change. So it's really nice that in Java you can't have global variables, and so I would strongly encourage you not to have them in your JavaScript program either. So always put var in front of any variable you want to declare, so that when you're done using that variable, like in function example, when we're done using x, it goes out of scope. So if we want to use x for something else somewhere else, we can, but we won't be using the value of x that was set in example. Unfortunately for y, if we end up using y in any other method, or even in the code that exists outside of methods in JavaScript, we end up picking values. We end up getting values of y that have been messed around with by this function example. That is just bad news. Okay. One last thing, which is that I wanted to share with you, which is when you're working with methods or in JavaScript functions, it's good to know how arguments are passed in to the method. So I wanted to show you a couple different functions. So this is version 1 of a function, and this function I'm going to call by 10. So the goal of this function is to try to change the value of x in the caller, all right? So attempt number 1, if I say x equals x times 10, and I say var x equals 1, and then I say by 10 x, and then I say console.log of x. What are we going to see for a value of x? So x is initially 1, then we say by 10x, and that means that this x gets copied into this function, and then we do the calculation, x equals x times 10. So at this point, on the next line right here, x is going to be equal to 10, right? But when we return from the function, we lose this x goes out of scope, and there is no connection between this x right here and this x right here, other than they have the same name. So when we say console.log x here, we're going to get the value of 1. So just go over that again. Var x equals 1, by 10x, this x value gets copied to this x value, and it's copied, and then the connection between those two x's is broken for the duration of the call to function by 10. And that's why when we say console log x here, we're going to get the original value of x, because it's the x that was defined outside of the methods. We're going to get the value of 1. Now, can we mess with that? You bet we can. Why don't we try? Why don't we try doing that? All right. So, function by 10, x equals x times 10, var x equals 1 by 10, console.log x. Okay, so in this case, we're using that global variable technique, which I'm not a big fan of, but you can use it. And in this example, what's happening is the global variable x gets set equal to 1. We call by 10, then the global variable x gets multiplied by 10. So x now has the value of 10. And when we do the console log of x here, we're going to get the value of 10 printed out. Okay. So is there any way to pass something into a function and change it so that the caller sees the change? And the answer is yes. If you pass in complex types and change them, you're not actually passing the complex type in, you're passing a reference to the complex type. So let's take a look at an example of how that could work. So an array is a complex type. So function by 10x. And we'll take a look at how that works in just a second. I'm just going to write the code down here to make it set it all up. So I'm going to say var x equals, and it's an array that contains the value of 1. All right, so now x is a reference. So if I say by 10x and then console.log x sub 0, I am actually going to get the value of 10 if I write this properly. Okay, so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to say in here, I'm going to assume that this x that's being passed into me is an array. X sub 0 is equal to x sub 0 times 10. Okay, so this is x, this is x sub 0. So that has the value of 1, so that's 1 times 10, which is 10. Then we're stuffing the 10 in here, so now x sub 0 has the value of 10. And when we return, since we've when we make this method call by 10x and we're connected to this x, what we're copying when we make that by 10 call is we're copying the reference to the array that x is to here. So this x now has a reference to the array. Then we use that reference to get the first element and multiply it and stuff the value back in the first element. And then when we say console log x10 on return, we're going to get the value of 10. Let me explain that one more time, okay? So in this example over here, the x on the outside is actually a reference to an array that has the value of 1 in it. The x from by 10 also is a reference to this array that has the 1 in it. And the reason why that x by 10 is a reference is because when we make the call to by 10, we copy the reference that x outside has, the x outside the method. We copy that to x, the x that's in the by 10 method. Now that x sub 0 gets changed, gets multiplied by 10, so it now has the value of 10. And when we return and this x by 10 goes away, goes out of scope, we're still left with x outside pointing to that 10, and we can console log it. All right, excellent. All right, we're ready to do some real interesting stuff in JavaScript, so stay tuned.